Imagine 5 centuries of armored cavalry getting annihilated in a few hours on a muddy French hillside. The killers? Peasants with wooden bows. Here's why the Age of Knights died in a single afternoon and how brutal it was. Crecy, mid-14th century Europe, was brutal and far from peaceful. It was a huge mess of bloodlines, inherited claims, and feudal obligations that were all enforced by armored men on horseback. These men were knights. At the center of this web was standing Edward III of England, who believed he had a legitimate claim to France through his mother, Isabella of France. To the English, this was rightful inheritance, and to the French nobility, it was absolutely unthinkable. They were angry that Edward was even thinking like that. When Philip VI rejected Edward's claim in 1337, it started a revolt that was bigger than a simple war. It was full of grinding, generational struggle for legitimacy that history would later call the 100 Years' War. Edward didn't even seek a decisive battle initially. He just wanted something more psychologically devastating. He wanted to publicly humiliate the French king because he rejected his apparent rightful throne. Landing in Normandy during the summer of 1346, his army moved quickly and deliberately, destroying villages, burning crops, and looting towns. This campaign was a calculated destruction that was designed to prove one brutal point, that Philip VI couldn't even protect his own kingdom. In this way, France needed a new royalty. Contemporary chronicles, like John Froissart, described widespread panic across northern France. There was smoke rising everywhere, and it became a political weapon that was more powerful than any sword. Philip couldn't ignore this assault. He summoned his vassals, and they came. They were coming from across France and beyond. Princes, dukes, counts, allied kings from Bohemia, nobles from the Low Countries. Everyone was there. This wasn't just the French army. It was Europe's feudal elite all gathering together because they had all trained for war since their childhood. Their armor alone was worth more than the entire peasant villages that produce crops in a lifetime. Their war horses were basically weapons for them. For 500 years, men like these had decided to battle with a single thunderous charge, and to them, Crecy wasn't at risk, but it was destiny playing out exactly as it should. They needed to crush the British. It turned out to be worse for them. Edward's trap. Edward III understood that the hate with Philip's was brewing to dangerous levels. He understood something that other enemies didn't, that the battle wouldn't be won by courage. It would be won before the fighting even started. Outnumbered more than 3-1 and exhausted from weeks of marching, Edward made the choice that seems insane if we think about today, or even the traditional military thinking of that time. The thing is, he didn't run. Instead, he chose the terrain. Near the village of Crecy, he positioned his roughly 9,000 men on a gentle slope. This was a simple advantage, and it didn't even look like an advantage to Philip's, but it was devastating. To reach the English, the French would be forced to attack uphill through increasingly soft and churned earth. Gravity and mud would do half the work, and the rest of the work would be handled by the British soldiers. Then came the formation. Edward divided this army into 3 defensive units. Between them, he had approximately 5,000 English and Welsh longbowmen in a wide V-shaped formation. This formation was designed to overlap fields of fire and turn the entire hillside into a killing funnel. The most shocking order came next. Edward commanded his knights to dismount. They were men who were raised from birth for the glory of mounted cavalry charges, men whose war horses were worth a fortune, and now they were stripped down into mud to fight shoulder to shoulder with common soldiers. According to Froissart, this order caused genuine dismay and disbelief within English ranks, and even made them feel a little discouraged. To fight on foot was to abandon the centuries of chivalric tradition and social hierarchy. Edward didn't even hesitate to explain. He just ordered everything. Survival mattered more than pride or tradition at this point. And next came the method of preparing the killing ground, which the French fighters had no idea what they were getting into. Preparing the ground. While French nobles were arguing about who would claim the honor of killing the English king, as they were so certain, the English prepared the battlefield with brutality that they were not even ready for yet. Sharpened wooden stakes were driven into the ground at angles designed to impale the charging horses. Shallow ditches and small pits were dug under the cover of darkness, and they were invisible from a distance but deadly up close. Then the weather came. There were dark clouds that rolled in and fell across the fields. To the French, this was a minor inconvenience, because they outnumbered the English forces heavily. To the English, it was an unexpected advantage. The longbow required dry strings to maintain power and range. English archers calmly unstrung their bows and tucked their strings behind cloaks and helmets to keep them dry. The Genoese crossbowmen were hired by France, and they didn't take these precautions. Modern experiments conducted by military historians even confirm what the medieval chronicles observe. They saw wet bowstrings losing range and penetrating power dramatically. That night, the English ate, rested, and waited in position while the French arrived late, hungry, and dangerously impatient to get their revenge. Before we reveal what happened next and the gravity of destruction, subscribe now because we have more videos coming for you. The first attack. A lot of people get it completely wrong on how the battle began, and it didn't even begin with strategy. It began with aristocratic pride that was completely overriding military sense. Philip VI gave a clear order. It was to wait until morning, like the men rest and attack in organized formation. His noblemen ignored him completely, and the French king surged forward on their own initiative because they had enough of the disrespect from English troops. Once the first rank moved forward, the whole discipline fell entirely. The army transformed from an organized force into an excited, chaotic crowd, sort of like they were Vikings of that age. The Genoese crossbowmen advanced first, 5,000 professionals who were hired at an enormous cost, but their large shields were still back with the baggage train. Their crossbows were soaked by the earlier rain, and they were sagging and weakened significantly. They fired the first attack, and most bolts fell pathetically short of the English line. Then the English answered. 5,000 longbowmen were released simultaneously, and witnesses wrote that the sound was like continuous thunder. Each skilled archer could lose approximately 12 arrows per hour. That means more than 60,000 arrows per second fell from the sky. The Genoese men broke almost immediately. They turned and ran back towards the French line and were promptly cut down, not by English but by their own employers. According to the chronicles, a French noble shouted in fury to kill this rebel blocking our way. Mounted knights then charged straight into their own, retreating mercenaries, trampling and slashing them apart to clear the path. The real battle. Then came the main cavalry assault, which was approximately 12,000 armored knights who were advancing uphill through mud over bodies, through the chaos that their own army had created. The long-range arrows were penetrating horses, and even heavily armored horses had vulnerable points like eyes, mouth, nostrils, and legs. A wounded warhorse would never continue charging forward in the disciplined formation. It would scream and finally collapse, becoming a half-done obstacle, blocking the path of other horses behind it. Momentum was everything. The English troops were behind. At close range, English bodkin arrowheads punched through the weak points in armor, like visors, joints, armpits, and inner thighs. Modern ballistic testing even shows that when arrows failed to fully penetrate plate armor, the blunt impact was still devastating. Wave followed wave. There were 16 separate charges throughout the afternoon, and each assault was more disorganized and desperate than the last. The battle Edward had so carefully prepared now did the brutal work. Horses fell into hidden ditches, knights crashed into sharpened stakes that were hidden in the grass, and mud was churned by thousands of hooves. Armored troops became a trap in itself. Dismounted knights were weighing 60 pounds of armor, and they could barely stand upright, let alone even fight effectively. English archers did their job until their quivers were empty. They calmly ran forward, pulling the arrows from dead, dying men, and firing those same arrows back at the web. The French were literally being killed by their own steel and their own projectiles. Then the John of Bohemia, who was the blind king, rode forward into the battle. He had been blind for 10 years but refused to flee or hide. His knights tied their horses, ran into the mound, and led him forward into the slaughter. They died together. It was the last pure gesture of chivalric honor, and it vanished completely into the mud of Crecy. The next morning, after the darkness finally fell, the British didn't celebrate. They stayed exactly where they stood. They had their weapons ready, and any wounded Frenchman who would move was killed instantly. There was no mercy and no ransom. By morning, more than 1,500 French nobles were lying dead on the field. This includes princes, counts, dukes, and men whose names defined entire regions. Philip VI himself was wounded heavily, and an arrow struck his jaw. His bodyguards literally dragged him from the field as he tried to return to fighting. The second oriflamme, the royal banner that is said to guarantee French victory, was also abandoned in the mud like a worthless cloth. English losses were unbelievably small compared to the French forces. Only around 40 men died in a battle with only 2 knights and 1 English knight for every several hundred French nobles that were killed. The disparity was so huge that some chroniclers even refused to believe these numbers. After this, there weren't even enough surviving French nobles to bury their dead with proper rites. Bodies were lying, rotting for days. Crows and wolves fed on the flesh that had worn princely titles just hours before. Local peasants crept onto the battlefield and stripped armor worth almost fortunes, melting down steel that had utterly failed to protect its owner. Entire regions lost ruling lords overnight. A feudal administration collapsed in some areas, laws went unenforced, and power vacuums spread across the entire northern France like a plague. Crecy wasn't just a battlefield. It was a social and political shockwave that sent the entire continent into depression. For centuries, war had preserved and strengthened the noble class to ransom glory. But at Crecy, war devoured the entire nobility itself. 10 years later, at Poitiers in 1356, Frenchmen almost repeated the same mistake, which was charging uphill into prepared English positions. They lost another kind there who was captured and ransomed this time. The muddy slope near Crecy became a battlefield of death for the French soldiers. Do you think they could have avoided this slippery slope? Let us know in the comments down below, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video.